Introducing Matt Walsh, the woman understander. After spending multiple hours on a quest to find out why women are repulsed by him, he's turned his attention to the archaeological community, where none of his subjects can argue with him, because they're dead.
I have observed, as many others have, many times, that despite anyone's gender identity, quote unquote, the fact is that when they die, and I said this on Dr. Phil, I said it in What is a Woman, when you die and are buried in the ground and your flesh rots away, leaving only your bones, all that will be left, almost all, is your sex. No matter how you identified, when archaeologists and anthropologists of the future exhume your grave and look at your remains, they will declare you male or female. Your self-identity will be gone, but your sex will remain.
Hello. Since the bone sex understander Matt Walsh logged on, every archaeologist in the world has been shaking in their boots, practically trembling with fear that this poor man's Ben Shapiro might finally be the one to finally uncover their hidden truth. That gender is stored in the bones. Luckily, the Daily Telegraph has hired a new science reporter, me, Brigitte Empire, to fight Matt Walsh in the YouTube equivalent of trial by combat, the response video. As a paleontologist, it is up to me to rescue my colleagues in the field of archaeology and unite all of the bone scientists under one osteological banner, the Avengers of old things. Welcome, Mr. Walsh, to the Thunderdome that is the Empire Statement. Hi, it's Brigitte Empire. So, the rumours are true. I was fired from my job at the Daily Telegraph a few weeks ago for being insufficiently patriotic. In my video on Winston Churchill, I fell for a classic trap set by the woke mob, namely, reading too much history. As such, I was unable to defend Churchill in the way expected from me as a member of the British colonist class. As such, there have been some videos released on this channel which could be perceived as left-wing. Well, let me tell you, that stops today. That stops right now. After a long meeting with my editors, I finally been given my job back. And as the Daily Telegraph's returning science and culture correspondent, we've established some ground rules. If you hear any rhetoric that could be construed to be to the left of Margaret Thatcher pass from these lips on my channel, no, you didn't. That was someone else. A hacker. Someone stealing my identity. And someone, importantly, legally distinct from any columnist at the Daily Telegraph. Well, now that we've got the legalese out of the way, let's try to go through the wild claims of the Daily Wire's least talented correspondent without breaking the terms of the legal agreement I just read out. God help us all, God save the king. You might recognise Matt Walsh as the man behind the hit documentary, What is a Woman? An overly long smear project against trans people in which Walsh repeatedly asked leading experts what a woman is, and acted like he hadn't got a good answer when the answer took longer than 3 seconds to explain.
Well, I think when someone tells you who they are, you should believe them. So if a person says that they're a woman or they're a man, then that's them telling you their gender is. I'm not so sure what social interactions would have to do with maleness or femaleness. And why are you concerned with when someone else tells you that they're a man, or even if they use the word male, why are you concerned with not believing them?
This is a theme we will be coming back to in his coverage of sex and bones and archaeology. Matt Walsh demonstrates throughout his entire body of work that he has trouble with any academic topic once it passes the 101 level. Whereas Matt Walsh has a fairly good grasp of high school biology, XX and XY chromosomes leads to male or female characteristics, for example, but the other way around, he fails to comprehend that the reason that this is the version taught in high school and not at the undergrad level and beyond is that it is essentially a gross oversimplification. It's what we in science call a lie. A little lie that helps explain some of what you need to know to have a basic grasp of the subject. So, for this example, XX and XY chromosomes usually lead to male or female characteristics, but sometimes someone is born with XXY chromosomes, or they are born with XX or XY, but their body doesn't respond to hormones as one usually does, and so they develop differently to what you'd expect based on those chromosomes, and a whole host of other things that lead to intersex conditions in a small percentage of the population. This isn't taught at a basic level because it's not necessary to understand the basic function of sex chromosomes in the majority of cases, but that doesn't mean it's not true. But when Matt Walsh comes across an example like this, however, that's exactly how he reacts. When Walsh receives an answer to his question, what is a woman, that isn't someone with a vajoo, he becomes frustrated, tunes out, or edits the answer so that less of it is legible and documentary. This habit he repeats in the video which is the subject of this one. Woke historians want to remove sex from our bones. Jesus Christ, is that the actual name of the video? He knows the difference between historians and archaeologists, right, Dan? And how would you remove the sex from... Oh, hold on. I'm getting a call from my editors. Yes? Really? Are you sure? Ooh, well, okay. Sorry, everyone. Apparently, the editorial line has just come in, and apparently I completely agree with this. Historians are woke now. Basing our knowledge of history on multiple sources and updating our knowledge with new discoveries? That's woke. And sex? Sex is stored in the bones. And the woke mob is at this very moment gathering outside your door, pitchforks at the ready, to strip your precious manhood/womanhood from your skeleton. Protect it at all costs, people of Britain, lest woke historians render the flesh from your body and leave you a sexless pile of ash and bone, never to be sexed again. Better? Better, Dan? Okay, my editor's saying that's more like it. So let's get into what Matt Walsh means by this, and how that matches up with the more real, scientific understanding of what we can learn about dead people's sex from their bones.
I have observed, as many others have, many times, that despite anyone's gender identity, quote unquote, the fact is that when they die, and I said this on Dr. Phil, I said in What is a Woman? When you die and are buried in the ground and your flesh rots away, leaving only your bones, all that will be left, almost all, is your sex, no matter how you identified. When archaeologists and anthropologists of the future exhume your grave and look at your remains, they will declare you male or female. Your self-identity will be gone, but your sex will remain.
Oh. Oh, well, that's bollocks. Okay, before my editors give me another angry phone call, let me explain. There are a number of things a skeleton can tell us about the person who once occupied it, especially when taken in the context of its dig site, burial goods associated with the site, or method of burial. For example, if a skeleton is found with a load of jewellery, lavish grave goods, or buried in a place of great importance to the culture of the period, we can infer that the person buried was revered by the community, perhaps a king, a priest, or someone of similar significance. Bodies are buried in different ways depending on the culture, social status, and even the event of death. You would be hard-pressed to say, for example, that the one thing left from the bodies found at Pompeii and Herculaneum was their sex, right? We learned about the scale and speed of the eruption that buried them, as well as tons about their culture. Even if we just look at a skeleton completely out of context, we can learn about injuries sustained in life, pathologies, and some cultural practices. Certain cultures ritually lengthen the skull, and this is preserved up in the skeleton upon death. Conditions like scoliosis remain distinctive in the skeleton, so distinctive in fact that finding a skeleton with scoliosis in a Leicester car park a few years ago was a huge clue to the fact the skeleton belonged to King Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England. That's dope as shit. You know, Richard III, famous child murderer, and ancestor to Hollywood actor Benedict Cumberbatch. Skeletons found in mass graves following battles tell us about the speed of the burial, and additionally, their injuries are often preserved in the skeleton, telling us a bunch about the weapons used in the battle that resulted in their deaths, and the types of damage they did to the human body in question. All of that's a lot more information than what sex someone had. Additionally, getting the identification of sex from bones is tricky and often inaccurate, unless you have the exact right convergence of factors, and even then, you're not going to get 100% accuracy, just a quite likely diagnosis. And that's not how Matt Walsh sells this, so let's get into how bones are sexed, and why sexing bones is trickier than conservatives would like us to believe. Oh, sorry. Text from my editors. I'm not allowed to imply conservatives are wrong, so let's instead look at what the rabid lobby of woke historians would have us believe about human anatomy. I got your back, Matt Walsh. You're the one true archaeologist. I mean, historian.
A report in the College Fix suggests otherwise. It says, quote, as soon as ancient human remains are excavated, archaeologists begin the work of determining a number of traits about the individual, including age, race, and gender. But a new school of thought within archaeology is pushing scientists to think twice about assigning gender to ancient human remains. It is possible to determine whether a skeleton is from a biological male or female using objective observations based on the size and shape of the bones. Criminal forensic detectives, for example, do it frequently in their line of work. But gender activists argue scientists cannot know how an ancient individual identified themselves. Quote, you might know the argument that the archaeologists who find your bones one day will assign you the same gender as you had at birth. So regardless of whether you transition, you can't escape your assigned sex, tweeted Canadian master's degree candidate Emma Palladino last week. Palladino, who's seeking an advanced degree in archaeology, called assigning gender to an ancient human bullshit. Quote, labeling remains male or female is rarely the end goal of any excavation anyway, wrote Palladino. The bioarchaeology of the individual is what we aim for, factoring in absolutely everything we discover about a person into a nuanced and open-ended biography of their life.
In the hits video, woke scientists are trying to remove sex from your bones. Matt Walsh cites leading historical journal The College Fix, which concedes that you can infer age and race as well as sex from skeletons, which should be news to Walsh, considering how sure he was in the intro to his video that when we all die, all that remains is a big placard that reads pennis or vajoo. This article is a response to a single tweet from a Canadian master's student, Emma Palladino, who, understandably, has now set her Twitter profile to private. From what I can tell, the only people treating this as news are outlets to the right of Fox News, and all they're going off of is one single tweet from one single person implying that likely sex determination from skeletons isn't the be-all and end-all of how a dead person lived, and doesn't necessarily perfectly reflect their life, which should be fairly uncontroversial. In fact, the exact quote from her is so uncontroversial as to be completely trivial, quoting Palladino herself. Labeling remains male or female is rarely the end goal of any excavation anyway, tweeted Palladino on July 4th, according to the College Fix. The bioarchaeology of the individual is what we aim for, factoring in absolutely everything we discover about a person into a nuanced and open-ended biography of their life. That's unambiguously true. When archaeologists are looking at a dig site, they don't go in like, I wonder how many men and or women we will find at this site. They're looking for much more than that. Were there animal bones? Are there structures preserved? Clues to how these people live, perhaps? If anything, what these dead people might have had between their legs, possibly if we get the right convergence of bones in the same place, is one of the least interesting things you can find at a dig site. So, thought experiment time. I, as a paleontologist, go to an archaeological site, as I have on several occasions. In this site, there are two skeletons. One with a skeleton one could only describe as classic Chad. I would be much less excited by the concentrated maleness of the skeleton that I found if the other skeleton was covered in jewelry and appeared to have been crushed by a giant fucking boulder. I'd have many more questions about the latter, whether this was some sort of ritual, part of how the society that they came from buried important people. Was this evidence of a rebellion? Than I would about the sheer squareness of Paleo Chad's immensely masculine jaw. Fan art of Paleo Chad I will commission. Sex, I'm afraid to say, isn't that sexy? But if we truly have to get into what bone sex is and how we determine it, let's do just that. My editors might want me to cite Matt Walsh. Well, they can't complain if I cite the actual science, can they? Let's ask an established professor at the University of New England how to identify differences in the human skeleton instead. Is that woke? Dan, is university woke? It is? Oh, well, fuck it, we're doing it anyway. I'm putting my job on the line for you, science. This had better be worth it. You gotta come through.
When we're looking at determination of sex on a human skeleton, there are two main areas that we look at. We look at the skull and we look at the pelvis. So if you have a skull and a mandible of an individual, you have a 90% chance of determining whether that individual is male or female. So while there are indicators of sex on other parts of the skeleton, the head and the pelvis are going to be the most reliable. And if you have both of them together, that's going to give you a very, very reliable estimate of whether you have male or female. On the back of his skull, there is a point, and that's something called a nuchal crest or an inion hook. And that is a trait that you find purely on male skeletons. The next trait I'd like to talk about on the skull is the mastoid process. What you will notice is a very long piece of bone that comes out just behind the jawline, and that's known as the mastoid process. Now, men have very developed mastoid processes, and we look at her mastoid process, you'll see that it is not as robust. Now, if you're thinking about these things, one of the challenges here is going, well, okay, I have a mastoid process, I can identify that on my skull, but how do I know whether it is very robust, meaning very large, or very small? And this is where determination of the sex of an individual becomes a bit more difficult, because you need to take several traits into account at the same time. Now, I also want to qualify that and say that that is something that is undeniably Caucasian male. Both Bonnie and Clyde are Caucasian individuals. They're modeled after real individuals, and they were chosen because the differences between them are very clear. Bonnie is smaller, Clyde is larger. She has what we would call a more gracile skeleton. Her bones are a bit smaller, they're a bit lighter, a bit thinner. She's overall smaller and more gracile, whereas Clyde is the opposite. But those lines begin to blur. You can have a gracile female, you can have a gracile male. You can have a robust female or a robust male. And to illustrate that point, I want you to think of Prince, or the newly departed, as of late departed Prince, and Venus Williams. So Prince was a rather small man, and Venus Williams is a rather large woman. So we would say that Prince was gracile and Venus Williams was robust. Now, if we had both of their skeletal remains and we looked at both of them and we just did this determination on the basis of size, we'd probably come up with the wrong assignation of sex. So males tend to have a forehead which slopes back at greater than a 90-degree angle. The next thing I want to talk about is the brow ridge. Men tend to have more robust or well-developed brow ridges. You can see them, they're very obvious. And I want you to just look at the overall shape and morphology of her pelvis. Now, her pelvis is what I would call relatively low and wide, and Clyde is a bit narrower and taller. And the reason for this main difference, or the main difference in shape, is childbirth. So this is a trait that you might be able to use if you have a fragmented skeleton. So in archaeology, we would be very lucky if we found a completely 100% intact individual, and oftentimes that doesn't happen.
So, to recap, if we have both the skull and the hips intact on a single skeleton, and that skeleton was likely European, we have a pretty good shot at sexing a skeleton correctly, especially if they have a bunch of the typical features that we need to sex a skeleton at the same time. Say, a prominent brow ridge, a notch in the back of the skull, narrow hips, in a skeleton, say, found in Central Ireland, where most people were white. If we found a skeleton like that, we could be fairly confident that its former owner was a man. Probably, maybe. Sex differences are pronounced, however, to different levels depending on race and geography. And a lot of this feeds into the recent moral panic about trans women competing in women's sports. Anyone who doesn't fit into the standard image of petite white women is seen by people like Matt Walsh as inherently closer to maleness. See Casa Semenya getting pulled from sporting events for having a higher than average testosterone level compared to her white competitors, and the amount of other black women being singled out for sex tests to check they aren't really men, when they be one of the rarest breeds of Karen, Olympic Karen, in the contest of physical prowess. Now, while my colleagues in the British press might see this as a question of fairness in sports, this automatically places the physiology of white women as the default, and the same is true in archaeology too. We cannot universalize these properties to the entirety of the human species, but we can sometimes use them in conjunction with contextual knowledge and other factors to build a pretty accurate image of the past. Depending on the level of preservation of the skeleton, a lot lot of the time, the bones you need to identify someone correctly just aren't there, I'm sorry to say. I know a lot of you see like Indiana Jones and assume every time someone goes to an archaeological site, everything's perfectly preserved. You know, foxes like to take bones away from things when they're buried. It happens quite a lot. And it's not just them. Matt Walsh can proselytize all he likes about bone sex being the last thing left of you. But if Matt Walsh were to be, say, eaten by a pack of wolves, a lot of his bones wouldn't be in a state with which that is even possible. His DNA might be, but who knows? Maybe the wolves got all of that too. And whichever Daily Wire obsessed scientist decides to Jurassic Park Matt Walsh back from the dead in 100 years from the DNA in his bones might accidentally end up combining the DNA of the two animals and resurrecting a werewolf by accident. You never know. Now, if we take another collection of bones, say the ones I'm likely to leave behind, we might get a less clear answer than our hypothetical Paleo Chad left us. As much as I love the term Paleo Chad, and I do. Paleo Chad and Olympicaran artwork, please. Thank you. As someone who was assigned male at birth, I know, shocking, I do have a distinctive notch in the back of my skull. And I am white, astonishingly white according to my 23andMe results. So we don't have to adjust our expectations based on race. All of my ancestors practically came from Britain and Ireland. How? I've got American ancestors. How do they just fuck people from Britain and Ireland? I don't understand. Ancestors, why? Just have sex with one other person. So, according to my ethnic background, we don't need to adjust our expectations based on race for looking at my skeleton. But I also never had a brow ridge, despite going through a full male puberty. And I'm sure this will break Matt Walsh's brain to comprehend. I have Pixar mum hips. That's the scientific term. I have Pixar mum hips. And that's not surgical. I've had those pretty much from jump, like from the moment my hips grew to their full extent, I was like, damn! And, it's pretty much gender euphoria from there on out. Now, I am almost 6 foot tall, and along with my broad shoulders and skull notch, they might well get me sexed as male from my bones, but the margin of error would be larger than our long-dead Chaddington model, given my hips, lack of brow ridge, and small hands. As much as you might not realise how small they are from the amount I'd throw them in the camera and make them look massive. Hello, I've got normal hands. In addition to this, any of my clothes that happen to survive, as well as evidence of my life, would point to the fact that I assumed a female social role for most of my life. So I'm sorry to break this to Matt Walsh. That is something that would be incredibly interesting to future archaeologists and anthropologists. They wouldn't just ignore that stuff, they take that into account. They, unlike my employers, don't go around throwing away scientific evidence that could teach them about people's culture and social norms. That's the most interesting part of archaeology, just because they look a bit woke. Wouldn't it be interesting to find woke Romans? That wasn't even in the script. Woke Romans? What would that even look like? Ah, Gaius, I see you over here talking to that Gaul. No, Maximus, the term Gaul is incredibly offensive. Do you know how badly the Gauls have been treated by our people? I didn't understand. I'll learn and do better. The Romans were Italian. What accent was that? Okay, Dan, come back. Look, listen, the science bit's over now. Look, I'll show you my ancestry results, and you and my editor will calm down. Look, you wouldn't fire someone that's 97% British and Irish, would you? I didn't even mention intersex people, even though mentioning them and all the complications that they bring up here would definitely further complicate all of this and make Matt Walsh look pretty stupid. I'll talk about crime. Yeah? You love crime? He loves crime. Dan loves crime. My editors love crime. Okay, let's talk about crime. See, Matt Walsh is very concerned that the possibility that we can conceive of trans and gender non-conforming people existing in the past will absolutely destroy the effectiveness of detectives to solve cold cases. Cold cases are unsolved criminal cases that are re-examined years after the fact for whatever reason. I think this concern is mostly just Matt Walsh reaching for any potential scenario that could possibly be affected by what is honestly a non-issue for most people. But if we take him at his word on this, and don't just assume he's watched too many crime dramas and thinks cold cases are ripped a lot more often than they actually are, I will take it upon myself, as a stalwart upholder of cultural norms, to reassure Matt Walsh that nothing will fundamentally change in this regard. For one, many pre-colonial cultures across the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Polynesia had what we today would recognize as trans, gender non-conforming, or third gender members of society. These roles differ a lot with each society, of course, but it's not as if we're just adding something new onto history and trying to reach back in time with this stuff. Well, no more than we already do just by being modern humans with the biases that being modern humans brings with them into any discussion of the past. Secondly, just because we recognize that the conception of gender in the past isn't super rigid, doesn't mean that we're just going to stop determining the likely sex of a skeleton when we're trying to solve a crime. Most people are still male and female. If there's evidence that your ancient crime scene was too woke for Matt Walsh to handle, we can start talking about whether or not we're looking at someone other than a man or a woman. But in most cases, that just isn't going to come up at all. And if you're looking at a crime scene old enough that Western ideas of gender are being thrown up in the air, then why the fuck do you care what sex the skeleton is? Are you okay? Do you need some air? Show me on the doll where the moat mob hurt you. Seriously, the terms of my new contract require me to bash on wokeness at least once per video, so I'm not mistaken for a red. Speaking of which, Matthew Walsh, I have brought you here to bear witness to the many archaeological crimes committed by the woke mob. A once humble scientific field has, according to you at least, been taken over by a parade of they-thems with blue hair and brain worms. These woke moralists are henceforth on trial for the crime of updating the understanding of science with new evidence and facts. Our main piece of evidence? This absolutely sickening find. The wokest skeletons to ever find themselves dead in the sight of a right-winger. The lovers of Valdaro. Well, once, the proud archaeologists of Italy knew, in their bones, if you will, and Matt Walsh will, that this oldest of smoochers, most romantic of remains, was a male and female couple, buried as close to each other in death as they were in life. Recent chemical analysis, however, suggested the skeletons may have actually both been men. They might not have been, but they might have been. Homosexuals? In Italy? In ancient times? That's unheard of. Why, next you're telling me that Emperor Hadrian of Wall fame was gay, or that Emperor Elagabalus was transgender, or... What? Dan, if that's true, why do we always act like queer shit is weird? It's there in history. Ugh. Anyway, clearly this is some sort of sabotage by woke archaeologists trying to muddy our understanding of science and history by changing the gender of chemicals in the skeleton's teeth. You know how far the woke agenda will go to finally win. It's over. They've won. Archaeology has been defeated. It's woke now. And so, sadly, we're going to have to pull all funding from it. Sorry. I mean, the right's been doing that anyway for decades. Quite convenient, really. Oh, here we go. The phone call about this. I already put the request in. Hi, Liz. Congratulations on assassinating Lizzie so efficiently. How's that economy looking? That bad? Well, would it help if I told you we got the okay from Murdoch and the gang to completely defund archaeology as a scientific field? Yeah? Super. Alright. See you at the Spectator Garden Party, bestie. Ciao, ciao. Where was I? Oh yes. We, the British Commentariat, arbiter of all that is good and right in the world, find the defendant, archaeology, guilty. Hello. We've had a lot of fun here today, but remember, it's never fun to complicate perfectly nice scientific fields with facts and evidence. Only Fleet Street gets to decide what's true. So, keep your brain pure and free of all that gay shit. Make sure you turn off your internet. stick your fingers in your ears and only behave exactly how we tell you to and believe exactly how we tell you to believe. Remember, if it isn't in the Daily Mail, it isn't science. Stay safe, and thanks for watching. Oh, hi there, Poppets. You're still here. Please subscribe to the Brigitte Empire Patreon if you like this. It goes from £1 a month, and £1 is increasingly worth less and less, so pretty cheap if you ask me. And if you do, your name will be read at the end of the credits, like Scarjack, Joey Cobalt, Naomi Wayne, and Nerania.
And Charles TSMTMS.
Could you join them? Yes, you could, and you should. And if you don't, you could donate for me on coffee. Same link, Brigitte Empire, BRIGITTEEMPIRE. Same on Patreon, patreon.com/BRIGITTEMPIRE. Or you can listen to my podcast with Luxander at MKG Podcast. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and goodbye.